All right, here we go. So I'm pre-recording these lectures and I'm going to post them for you guys to see. This is week 2 of Intro to Psychology. I hope that everybody has been keeping up on their readings. I hope that things are making sense. Last class was fantastic. So let's just review a tiny little bit. On the left-hand side of this slide is just a reminder about the no cell phone policy during in-person lectures. Obviously, this isn't one, but as a reminder, next week when you are in class, I very much expect you to either be taking notes by hand or via a laptop. Please do not take notes on a cell phone. Please don't use your cell phone to take pictures of the slides. That said, the texts for this year's class are Introduction to Psychology, which is an open access textbook. Fortunately, I've been working with Rutgers to help bring down the cost of textbooks to students, and that is one of the implementations right there. The second textbook for class is a nice short book called, see, do I have it right here? Yes, I do. We got 7.5 lessons about the brain. Nice and thin. This is the good stuff. Last week, I left off right before I was going to start talking about the history of psychology. On the right-hand side of this slide, here is this semester's calendar. Last week was your intro, just a basic intro. We did some learning to learn. We went over what is psychology, and we stopped right before we hit the history of psychology, which we're going to do today. And then there will be a separate video that goes over psychological science. So between these two videos, this will be in lieu of the in-person lecture that was supposed to have happened tonight, September 19th, the most important day of all time in the month of Chris-tember. You heard it here first. Okay, so let's talk about the history of psychology. As you can see, I already have it labeled, the super basic history of psychology. And I just want to double check that my audio is on. Yes, it is. See, you want to make sure you do this so that you don't lecture for an hour into a camera that's not recording your microphone. But fortunately, this one is. Super basic history of psychology. I'm going to be doing a lot more reading of my lecture scripts because I don't have the opportunity to pace back and forth at the frenetic pace I normally do. So let's see if this works. Okay. Here is an outline. If I were you taking notes, I would take a moment to write down each of these 7 points. This is the flow of today's lecture. We're going to start talking about ancient Greece. We're going to move on to the Enlightenment. After that, we'll go into the early era of psychology. Then we'll talk about how Charles Darwin's theory of evolution influenced psychology and beyond. And then we talk about post-war psychology in the United States. World Wars I and II had a drastic influence in how psychology as a field formed. Number 6 will be the super truly painful, super basic history of psychology, which once psychology gets established, I could do a nice little review of how it actually has, what its history is, what its development is. And then we start talking about the future of psychology. Go ahead and write this stuff down. Starting with ancient Greece. I'm going to keep this simple because, well, this isn't a history class, this isn't a philosophy class, but psychology is experimental philosophy to a certain extent if you're talking about the philosophy of mind, right? Because philosophy is a umbrella term under which there are many different branches. And we're going to be talking about how the philosophy of mind was the precursor to experimental psychology. So we start with Socrates and Plato. So let's just start with the basic idea. Let's set the scene. And the scene is The super duper interesting questions that we're going to be going over in this class that are covered in the field of psychology are questions that actually have been asked since the beginning of written history. And the answers always seem to need improvement, right? We haven't quite gotten to the answers to some of the dilemmas of the philosophy of mind that started in ancient Greece. So, what better place to start exploring these questions than ancient Greece, where powerhouse thinkers were pondering, among other things, the ins and outs of knowledge and mind. Right? Just imagine the beginnings of asking questions like, what is knowledge? What is the mind? Right? If the mind is the place where knowledge exists, well, then what accounts for there being a mind? What is knowledge, and how do we know what we think we know? How does this all fit into the examined life? Let's remember, the unexamined life is not worth living. That is a quote attributed to Socrates, ancient Greek philosopher. It's perfect, dovetails nicely. It's well beyond the scope of this class to review ancient Greek philosophy in detail, so I'm going to focus on the powerhouses of the powerhouses. We're going to talk about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. From there, I'll follow the thread of their ideas through history via other philosophers and scientists, just to show how their influence is still felt today. I apologize in advance to people who are actual philosophy buffs because I'm going to be treating these very briefly. So they're not going to be complete, we'll put it that way. So let's start with Socrates and Plato. Socrates, obviously an ancient Greek thinker, he didn't have any writings. So it is through Plato's writings that we learn about Socrates' ideas, since he didn't have any writings of his own. An idea attributed to both Plato and Socrates is the notion that knowledge is an abstract essence. And when we think of essence, it's like when you boil something down to the most essential components, that's what the essence is. So knowledge is abstract essence. For Plato, knowledge existed on a separate immaterial plane of existence that connects to and recycles our soul. So his idea of knowledge had a lot to do with his ideas of religion, mind, and body, right? He believed in souls. Knowledge could, therefore, never come through sense perceptions, right? Your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and touch, from the outside in, so to speak. So he was against outside in thinking. You can't trust the senses because actual information doesn't exist out there. It exists in here, and it is our soul that is able to go to this immaterial place where the essence of raw knowledge exists and bring it back to these material bodies. That's what knowledge is, right? So it has nothing to do with anything out there and drawing conclusions from your senses, what you see or what you hear, smell, or taste. It has to do with looking inward and finding the abstract essence of knowledge. So for Plato, we're born with knowledge. True knowledge and universal laws are buried deep within our reincarnated soul or subconscious. And then for him, we use deductive reasoning to apply them to specific experiences. This is just as a reminder. Deductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning that we use in formal logic or maths, starting with general rules and laws, and then practicing them on specific examples. You're deducing the answers to these specific examples based on the laws and rules that already exist. Plato's world flowed from the immaterial abstract to the material world. So what I want to point out in this painting that is the background of this slide, Plato is represented by the figure on the left. And please notice, and I don't know if you can tell in this picture or not, but please notice that he's pointing upward. And that was done on purpose. That is the artist's way of representing Plato's ideas as living up there wow, this is hard to shake loose, in an immaterial world. They live up there. So he's pointing upward. Let's look at the guy to the right of this slide, that is Aristotle. And I don't know if you can tell, but his hand is pointing outward and downward. And so, as you will see, that is the artist's way of representing Aristotle's thought just in his body posture. So Aristotle, who was one of Plato's best students, was also interested in deductive reasoning, but he repeatedly stressed the importance of its opposite, which is inductive reasoning. Instead of starting with a general rule and then logicking your way down to specific examples, induction begins with the observations and specific examples, and then derives a general principle or rule from those observations. Aristotle's raw material for knowledge through inductive reasoning is the thing Plato told us not to trust, your senses. This raw material, the senses, gets processed by the thinking mind or psyche, psychology, psyche, get it? Using both current and remembered sense perceptions. So you can see Aristotle is including what you see, smell, taste, and hear and feel into what he considers to be knowledge. So the raw material gets processed by the thinking mind or psyche using both current and remembered sense perceptions to arrive at general truths, right? So these aren't essential truths that are abstract. These are general truths. These general truths are arrived at, and you're not born with them. So whereas Socrates, Plato would think an inward approach to access knowledge is the path to gaining knowledge, Aristotle thinks the opposite. We're not born with it. We don't have that soul that does the thing that they think. What actually happens is sense percepts are understood in the context of previous sense percepts. From that, we make general rules about the outside world. From the outside world as stimulus, we make general rules about the outside world. All right, I'm repeating myself. I'm going to stop. So the truths that Aristotle's talking about are the same truths that Plato claimed were buried deep in our unconscious. Once we arrive at and establish these general truths, then for Aristotle, deduction can be used to predict future behaviors. So let's start with specific examples. With our thinking mind, we can come up deductive or inductively with a general rule. And now that we have that general rule, when we experience similar things, we can inductively reason what's going to happen. It's, oh my, do I keep messing this up? I do. I'm going to say it again. Hopefully I'll edit this out. We start with details. Inductively, we make a general rule. Once we have that general rule, we take it to predict what will happen deductively to specific examples. What I just said was the right version. Start with details, induct up to a general rule. Start with a general rule, deduct down to specific examples. Sorry, you can see why people find this confusing. I'm having a hard time just shaking it loose. Moving on. For Aristotle, knowledge is acquired through experience with the material world. I keep doing this for the material world. It's out there, not access to an immaterial essence that your soul has contact with. There have been theories about the natural state of mind since the beginning of recorded history. Right? What are we born with? How much of the environment influences us? Can we trust our sensory information? Why do the new Star Wars movies suck? With these questions and more, we move on to the 1600s. Enlightenment Europe. So we're going to carry on the theme started by Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and that theme pretty much being, where does knowledge exist? And in trying to account for it, these mechanisms called the psyche or the soul have to come up as places where knowledge exists. So let's move that forward. Starting with René Descartes. So, skeptical of received knowledge acquired and handed down over the first millennium and a half, Rene Descartes' goal was to reject all opinions he could doubt in the pursuit of his very existence. Right? So that's the context. The context is he's living in a world where received wisdom is valued, and he's skeptical enough to be like, you know what? Word of mouth information isn't that reliable. It's almost like Descartes was the first person to point out that folk psychology should be ignored. There has to be a better way than folk psychology. So he decided to just reject all opinions that he could doubt in his pursuit of his own existence. So, right off the bat, for him, for Rene Descartes, senses, reasoning, and thoughts are out of the question. Why? Because, respectively, senses can deceive, reasoning can fail, and thoughts can be illusions, right? We've all seen illusions, so our senses can, we have optical illusions, we have auditory illusions. Reasoning can fail. Reasoning is something that some people are better at than others, and even individuals that are good at it are better at it in some instances than other. So it is a little faulty depending on context. And thoughts can be illusions. And for this, Rene Descartes uses the idea of dreams, right? Dreams are ideas, but they're illusory. You can't trust the things that the thoughts that you have while dreaming. So immediately, Rene Descartes' like, okay, I'm going to throw away anything I can doubt. Senses, reasoning, and thoughts. Done. So Descartes concludes his very existence is his thinking self. You may have heard the term, this is Latin, cogito ergo sum, and it's usually loosely translated into, I think, therefore I am. To put it in the words of Descartes, ooh, maybe I can put some special effects on my voice. Check. No, that's not a special effect. Hold on a second. I'm actually going to make a special effect. It's an echo plate reverb. Yep, that's what we're doing today. For those of you that don't know what a plate reverb is, you will soon find out. Check. There it is. Now I'm going to talk like Rene Descartes with a plate reverb. Here's the quote. It was absolutely necessary that I, who thought this, was something. I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and so evident that no ground of doubt could shake it. I wish I could do that during live classes. So Descartes' views seem like a recapitulation or a retelling of, wow, having a hard time speaking, a recapitulation or retelling of Platonic thinking, in that universal truths exist in a mind or soul we are born with, and that has innate knowledge of the immaterial. In Descartes' case, God. Descartes is a religious person. And so religion played very favorably into his ideas of thought and his philosophy. Descartes claims we must have an innate idea of God since we do not experience him directly. So that was his logic. We have to be born with this sense of God because looking out amongst his creation, he doesn't reveal himself directly. Okay. And then comes John Locke. Descartes is to Platonic thinking as John Locke is to Aristotle's thinking, or let's see if I can pronounce this, Aristotelian thinking. Ooh, I'm trying to adjective that noun. At least on his tiny topic for the purpose of this class, John Locke is more like Aristotle and Rene Descartes is more like Plato. You might not hear that kind of breakdown in a legit philosophy class, but guess who already admitted this isn't a legit philosophy class? This guy. But this is legit philosophy that you need to know as the precursors for psychology. So let's have fun with this. John Locke thought that we derive our idea of God from visible marks of extraordinary wisdom and power in all the works of creation. That is, we are born blank until knowledge is derived from experience, interacting with the outside world. All right, so here's where the Aristotelian thing comes in. Aristotle and Locke both think that knowledge starts on the outside and works its way in. The way that John Locke talks about it is we are born a blank slate, or white paper, or tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, I believe, is also a Latin version of blank slate, and blank slate and tabula rasa are attributed to John Locke's thinking, but he actually just used the analogy of white paper. So the phrase tabula rasa, roughly translated as blank slate, is often used in reference to John Locke, but as far as I understand, he never used that term. So now I'm reading my script, which is a reiteration of what I just said. But in John Locke's words, let us then suppose the mind at birth to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? I answer in one word, from experience. In that, all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. White paper, blank slate, tabula rasa. I think we get the idea. Being born blank, knowledge is written on us through interacting with the environment. Let me say that again. Being born blank, a blank slate, white paper, knowledge is written on us through interacting with the environment. All knowledge is founded in experience. Moving on to David Hume. David Hume approached psychology as though he were Isaac Newton deriving the laws of motion with the fewest basic relations as possible. A very audacious strategy, let's not deny that. Hume's project was to explain all of our mental activity using three things: impressions, ideas, and principles of association. Let me say that again. Because Hume wanted to do what Newton did to physics, except Hume wanted to do it to psychology and morals, his project was to explain all of our mental activities using the fewest variables possible. For him, those were impressions, ideas, and associations. So, humans, for Hume, are just a bundle of perceptions. In his own words, time for some reverb. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I may venture to affirm the same in the rest of mankind, that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions. I doubt that he spoke like that, and I don't care. It's fun. Okay, so he is now bringing this idea of, okay, if we're starting with impressions, well, impressions are things from sense percepts, right? Sensations are impressions. And then ideas are what our mind does with those perceptions. And the principles of association are these laws, according to Hume, of what is done with those percepts once we have them manipulated by our mind into ideas. So let's go over that. Perceptions from impressions, the first variable. Perceptions from impressions of the outside world or ideas from the inside world form more complex and abstract ideas. So this is the idea that starting with simple things, you can build complex things. This is going to be important a little bit later. They somewhat resemble, uniting these simple elements are their principal associations. What are associations? They're just connections, right? Pepper is associated with salt. You know, like when I say something and you finish the sentence for me, it means that they're associated, right? Pepper is to black as white is to black, you know, things like that. Those are associations. 4 Three specific associations that Hume talked about are, let's see, when variables resemble each other, we associate them with each other, right? So things that might be the same color or the same shape or the same size, we seem to put them perceptually into the same basket if they resemble each other. If they occur at the same time, at the same place, they get associated with each other, right? Think of a billiard ball. If we have one ball here and another one comes along, and we watch it stand still while it exchanges momentum with the other ball, and that other ball moves, we associate those two things together. Excuse me. So because they happen at the same time, at the same place, they're associated as one causing the other. Or one occurs right before the other such that we perceive a cause-effect relationship, which is exactly what I just said. So cause and effect would be the billiard ball. One ball comes, it stops, and then the next ball moves. It looks like the first ball caused the second one to move. So that's an association. Happening around the same time or the same place could be that cause-effect thing, or it could be more general things. Any things that happen at the same time and place, we have a habit of mind of putting together, right? So for instance, in America, we eat sweet foods for breakfast. Right. Well, that's eating sweet foods at around the same time or place over and over and over again. We now think of breakfast as having sweet components where other cultures don't, right? Meals are meals. What you eat for a lunch is just as good a breakfast as anything else. But in America, we associate breakfast with sweet things. So there's an association of same time and same place. And then, of course, there's the resembling thing. Just think sports, right? The teams are festooned with uniforms to ensure that each of them looks the same to each other, but different from the other team. So there's an easy example of things that resemble each other belong together. All right, moving on. Locke and Hume infer our perceptions to be the building blocks of the mind, an intuition that thousands of years later informed the psychological approach of structuralism. Remember when I said that it would be important for you to understand that from simple things, complex things can be built? Let's start talking about the early era of legit psychology. Everything up until now has been philosophy. So let's kill this. Look at this guy. Ernst Weber. Not playing around. He is serious. Look at him. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, early psychologists concentrated on the studies of the senses. This is also called psychophysics. Psychophysics allows you to start with relatively easy answerable questions about sense percepts. We're going to talk about that in a second. Things like reaction time, things like visual acuity, which is just how well can you see, which are certainly easier to study and measure than something complex like consciousness itself, right? So if you were a researcher living in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you didn't have all the crazy awesome technological advances we have now, but you still had questions about the mind, this was their strategy of trying to unpack how the mind works. Well, we can measure sensations, and maybe those will be the small building blocks that we can later build a complex idea of mind or consciousness on top of. But first, we need all these little details about how well you see when lights are this strong or this dim and this far away and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Where was I going with that? Okay, researchers discovered major differences and counterintuitive patterns when they looked at the objective amount of change in a stimulus and how it was subjectively perceived. The mathematics that describe the relationship between a physical stimulus and its perceived properties is called a psychophysical function. All right, you should be writing this down in your notes. Psycho, P-S-Y-C-H-O, physical, P-H-Y-S-I-C-A-L. Psychophysical means psycho, mind, percept, physical, outside world. So how is the outside world perceived? When my light is on 10 increments and I increase it to 20 increments, I've increased it by a factor of 2. Does my perception of the light increase by a factor of 2 as well? The answer is no. But it took until these physicians essentially started looking at psychophysics before we found that stuff out. So it's called it's called psychophysics again, because it relates the perception of psychology to physics of the external stimuli. Such research demonstrated the feasibility of scientific research on psychological questions. Welcome to the beginning of the science of psychology. Once we had a foothold on a way to measure mental events, now the doors were open for people to do research into the mind in the way that they weren't able to do before. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about my man, Ernst Weber. Yeah, and I'm going to pronounce his name like that too, Weber. Here's a day in the life of Ernst Weber. Just put yourself in this position here. I'm going to make myself a little bit bigger because this is story time. So imagine taking a draftman's compass. Do you guys remember compasses? You know, you put a pencil in one end and the edge in another piece of paper and you're able to draw circles. You know what I'm talking about, a compass, right? So you take a draftsman compass, and this is a day in the life of Weber over here. Wait, over here, this guy. And touch the two ends on your arm. Okay. And it's not going to be your arm. You're going to be testing a participant. So you place these 2 points on the arm of a participant, noticing that the further apart the points, the easier it is to perceive 2 separate points. So let me use this as an example. If the 2 points are this close, you just perceive it as one sensation. The further apart I make the sensations, the easier it is to perceive that this is a separate stimulus than this. That should make logical sense. The further apart something is on your skin, the more you notice that it's 2 separate stimuli. This critical distance where you can't tell it's 2 stimuli to when you can tell it's a stimuli is called the just noticeable difference, or the JND. If you want to impress people at dinner parties, just slowly work phrases like just noticeable difference or JND into your conversation, and all of the science nerds' ears will perk up. They'll be like, oh, this guy knows what they're talking about. So it's called the just noticeable difference because it is the point at which, once crossed, you can reliably detect a difference in sensations above chance. Okay. And Weber, doing this research, came up with his own psychophysical function, and it's called Weber's law. So now the story time's over. Weber was performing psychology's first true experiments by these, taking compass points and determining just noticeable differences on skin. What he was essentially doing was altering one variable at a time to observe its effects on a second variable. His hypothesis, the smallest difference we can perceive between 2 stimuli, is not objective, but rather subjective, and varies with the intensity of the stimulus. This hypothesis is what's known as Weber's law. For each sensory modality, vision, hearing, touch, smell, or taste, the ratio between the perceived just noticeable difference and the objective magnitude of the standard stimulus is a constant. Let's take vision for an example. Regardless of the starting magnitude for light intensity, it requires a change of 1/60th of the starting magnitude for us to notice when the brightness of a light has changed. If you change the sensory modality, all you need to do is change that ratio. Each modality has a different ratio. For vision, it's 1/60th. That ratio is different for hearing. It's different for smell. It's different for taste. It's different for touch. But that is the discovery that Weber made. Ernst Weber was a big deal. He was kind of a rock star of his time amongst other researchers. He was at his time, and he still is, a super historical figure. We're about to talk about Wilhelm Wundt who is a contemporary of Weber's, who is considered the grandfather of psychology because he opened the first psychology laboratory, this guy that we're about to talk about, Wundt. Wundt was a fanboy of Weber, right? If Wundt is the grandfather of psychology, I would posit Weber is the godfather of the grandfather of psychology. Take that. Fight me. All right, so here is the very person I told you I was going to be talking about, Wilhelm Wundt. So at any moment in real life, you might experience the sensations of a fine meal's smell and taste, the sound of great music, or the touch and sight of your partner. These sensory elements of smell, taste, sound, touch, and sight serve as building blocks that merge into a more complex structure. In this case, an experience of a romantic evening, in case you couldn't pick up the details, or the hints, I should say. There's some logic to the idea that in order to understand something, it should be broken down or deconstructed to its most basic elements. And then once understood, those basic elements can be reconstructed with a newfound and complex understanding of the original structure. Not surprisingly, this approach, the one championed by Wilhelm Wundt over here, is called structuralism, and it started psychology as a science. Influenced again by Ernst Weber, Wilhelm Wundt established the first laboratory devoted to psychological research in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. That's a super important date in psychology, so you're going to hear me saying that over and over again. Leipzig, Germany, 1879, Wilhelm Wundt. One of Wundt's goals was to find the elements of experience comparable to those of chemistry. So again, he's taking a hard science approach to psychology to kind of get the scientific, experimental, research-oriented version of psychology started. Just as in Aristotle, Locke, and Hume's philosophies, Wundt's science of psychology thought the elements of experience are sensations and feelings. All right, so we started with Plato, who thinks that knowledge is essence, but then there's Aristotle, who thinks that knowledge is based on experience with the world. Then we move on to the Enlightenment. Descartes agrees with Plato. We have to look inward for knowledge. I think, therefore I am. And he's contrasted with John Locke, who's like, yeah, we're actually blank pieces of paper that experience from the world writes on, and that's what knowledge is, the written information on us as blank slates. And now we are in the early era of psychology, where Wilhelm Wundt is in line with more of a Aristotelian, Lockean, Humean version of science and pursuing the question of psychology than the Platonic Descartes version. Not that they weren't influential. Plato and Descartes are super influential. I'm just trying to tell you a trimmed down story. So between those two dichotomies, it's a false dichotomy that I purposely made for the purpose of class, Wundt is more like Aristotle than he is Plato. He's more like Locke than he is Descartes. Enough. I'm repeating myself again. Let's see. One of Wundt's goal science and psychologist is looking over my notes. Sensations are the contact point between the physical and the psychological. So think about that. Sensations are the contact point between the physical and the psychological. Again, he's studying psychophysics, so this language should sound somewhat familiar. Furthermore, Wundt maintained your experience is partly under your voluntary control. That is, you can shift your attention from one element to another, and you can change experience. Most of us aren't thinking about how the air feels on our left hand until I say something like that, right? But that's just a demonstration that your attentional focus can guide your mind as to what you're going to remember and experience in any environment. When testing participants, Wundt asked them to introspect. That is, he asked them to look within themselves and focus their attention on a specific element of experience. Participants engaged in introspection about intensity and quality of their sensations. That was a weird way to start that sentence. Let's try it again. Participants engaged in introspection about intensity and quality of their sensations, while researchers presented various kinds of sensory stimulus, like lights, textures, or sounds. So that was just a weird way. I got to rewrite that paragraph. What I'm trying to say there is when you're testing introspection and you're using psychophysics, what you're doing is you're changing, like let's use my light right here as an example. The experimenter is changing, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm dimming my light in small increments. Let's imagine this is an experiment where I rank this amount of light on a scale of 1 to 10, and then I take it down to that, and I make a rating of how intense that is. My subjective experience of these different levels of light are subjective, and I access them through introspection. I hope that makes sense. So Wundt was literally asking his participant, how bright is this light? How pleasant is this experience? How unpleasant is this experience? Can you tell the difference between stimulus 1 and stimulus 2? All of that super boring stuff. Wundt pioneered what was called the New Psychology movement, separating the new science of psychology from the more philosophical and theoretical approaches. And his many students carried versions of his ideas through Europe and America. Now, in America, obviously, his ideas, because we're Americans, were met with a little skepticism. So, of course, it took an American to be both a student of Wilhelm Wundt and a critic. So this new psychology thing that Wundt was pushing, William James was not buying it. He wasn't smelling what Wundt was selling. William James was too impatient to wait for each tiny grain of experience to be analyzed and assembled into a large experience. Instead of this structuralist approach, which assumes that knowledge is a kind of object you can deconstruct, William James preferred a functional approach that maintained the use of introspection as well, but it focused it on the everyday experiences as we experience them. That is, without focusing on all those tiny components that make up its structure, right? Nowhere in the real world are we sitting in a chair while somebody is playing with the brightness of a light and we tell them what we are experiencing, right? That is just not realistic. That is not real world experience. And William James is like, why don't we just study people doing real things in the real world, real people? Putting it bluntly, James thought any effort to isolate individual elements of a thought process by means of the new psychology, this Wundtian introspection, was doomed to failure. Why is that? Well, because he from James's perspective, experience functions as an ever-changing process. It's more like surfing. It's not a never changing structure like a surfboard. Thought is in constant change. Let me say that again. This analogy is mine, but I'm using it to help explain William James's idea. William James was against structuralists because he thought they were looking at they were approaching knowledge by trying to break down what a surfboard is, whereas James's functionalism was more interested in the actual process of surfing. And with that analogy, why would you break down what a surfboard is if you actually just want to learn how to surf? You could learn how to surf without actually understanding how the structure of a surfboard is made. Does this all make sense? James is like, forget that boring stuff. Who cares how it's made? Do you know how to surf? Show me. Why is surfing such an important analogy for me? I'll tell you in a moment. So Jamesian introspection attempted to access mental states which makes sense of the dynamic process of thoughts flowing like a complex stream of ideas. Do you get it now? Surfing water, stream of ideas. Thoughts flowing like a complex stream of ideas, and his approach to research was nowhere near as stringent as Wundt's. Few humans on Earth, as I understand it, were as stringent a researcher as Wilhelm Wundt. For William James, there are no static objects of the mind. There is just a stream of consciousness. So, which is it? Is it the case that structuralism is the truth and best way to do things? Or is it the case that functionalism is the best way to do things? While we'll see that most research paradigms in psychology currently still follow a bit of a structuralist approach, we're still trying to break down simple elements of things to help explain more complex versions of it. There are many more attempts at functionalist research because now we have technology that is facilitating trying to understand knowledge as an experience, as a stream, instead of as an object that you deconstruct. We're going to revisit James. Wait, this guy. We're going to revisit him when we start talking about emotions. Evolution and beyond. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection influenced psychology in many different ways. In addition to bruising the human ego by considering us just another animal, it opened our eyes to the power of invisible forces on perception, survival, and reproduction. Darwin argued that humans and other species share a remote common ancestor, placing humans in the category of all other living things. If this is the case, other animals should share features in common with humans, including some degree of intelligence. Well, with this in mind, if humans are just animals, then why not test other animals to find out more about humans, since we share so much, like a nervous system? We'll get into that next week, assuming you're a mammal. Another more subtle influence of Darwin's theory of evolution is that there are unseen forces that shape what we currently see and how we currently behave. If we can view ourselves as we do other organisms, then the current population of humans with our current abilities to perceive, communicate, think, feel, and behave, this is all a result of millions of years of evolution, of natural selection. We'll see that Freud takes this last idea of invisible forces affecting thoughts and behaviors. He'll take that idea to a whole new level, even comparing himself to Darwin at some points. Like Freud, in the same way that Hume wanted to be the Isaac Newton of psychology, Freud thought that he was the Charles Darwin of psychology. So we are now forced to talk about this guy. In the 1900s, Dr. Sigmund Freud developed a theory that was simultaneously a theory about developmental psychology, a personality theory, a theory of human motivation, a way to discover and diagnose mental disorders, and also a method for treating them. And they all had to do with each other, right? The treatment for the disorders has to do with the fact that the disorders are based on your personality, which is something that was developed early in life. So his developmental theory influences his personality theory, which influences his motivational theory, which talks about why things are abnormal. And then, of course, he has the solution to all of these problems with his form of therapy. It revolved around the inner workings of the unconscious mind. The it I'm referring to is Freud's theory. Freud's theory revolved around the inner workings of the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind, right? Imagine if the unconscious was a brand new concept to you, how revolutionary it would be, considering up until Freud, most humans very much thought that, the decisions that we make are made by us, and they're made rationally for reasons that we know. It is crazy for other people to say they know what's going on inside my head. That is crazy talk. But that's pretty much what Freud was saying. He's like, I might not know exactly what you're thinking, but I know how you're thinking. I don't know what you're thinking, but I know how you're thinking. And with that edge, I can facilitate an interpretation of your behaviors as being normal or abnormal. And if they're abnormal, I know how to treat them. So the unconscious is the invisible part of consciousness where other invisible dynamic forces determine what you think, what you feel, and how you behave. Freud also used introspection. Through guided introspection, Freud's psychoanalysis, that was his form of therapy, that's the name of it. Freud's psychoanalysis attempted to discover the unconscious mind's inner workings and laid the groundwork for clinical psychology. Please keep in mind that up until Freud, psychology's history is a history of experimental psychology. And remember, there are two different kinds, experimental and clinical. This is the beginnings of clinical psychology. The popularity of Freud's theory, with its use of introspection as a therapeutic technique to reveal the human mind at the unconscious level, combined with the introspective approach used in experimental research by Wundt's New Psychology and James's Functionalist Psychology, this left some experimental psychologists thirsting for a more observable and scientific way of studying human behavior. Hey, Freud's weird introspection and James and Wundt, their use of introspection, they're asking people to look inside a black box. Who cares what's happening with the mind when we can actually measure things like behavior? And that was the beginning of behaviorism. So here's just a reiteration. Introspection, used by Plato, Descartes, Weber, Wundt, James, and Freud, it assumes mental activity as the star of the show. Well, some behaviorists might just think, what if the mind is just an illusion? If I can predict your behavior based on observations and manipulating your environment, who cares what's going on in your mind? Oh, that's a heavy, heavy thought. All right. Let's go back to the whole, hey, why not test other animals to find out more about humans? Remember I talked about like Darwin, one of the revelations in psychology was, hey, we're just animals. And if we're just animals, then we can do this thing called comparative psychology. We'll get into that. With Darwin's theory of evolution opening the door for using animal models to learn about human behavior, the backdrop was set for behaviorism. Unlike structuralism and functionalism, behaviorism is a movement of psychology that concentrated on observable and measurable behaviors and not on mental processes. It's essentially an approach to learning based on this idea, pretty much what I just said, but here's the written version. It doesn't matter what you're thinking or feeling or what your incentives or motivations are. It is enough that I can predict and change your behavior just by observing and manipulating your environment. Knowing the contents of your thoughts is not necessary. Manipulating your environment is sufficient to change your behavior. No introspection needed. Behaviorism was started by this guy here, John B. Watson. He had an article called Psychology as the Behaviorist Sees It. And this is frequently referred to as the Behaviorist Manifesto. If you know anything about manifestos, it is a declaration of a program agenda. So John B. Watson in 1913 threw down the gauntlet, Psychology as the Behaviorist Sees It. Behaviorism should be the new way that psychology moves forward. Watson is popular in the history of psychology for his horribly unethical treatment of an infant named Little Albert. The Little Albert experiment we will be revisiting when we go over behaviorism and learning in depth. But we will be revisiting that later in the semester. But I think that what you need to know is that he changed an infant's behavior by hitting a large pipe with a hammer right behind the child. So anytime the infant moved towards something that John B. Watson didn't want him to move towards, he would hit the pipe with a hammer, making a loud sound, scaring the crap out of the child, causing it to cry. To no one's surprise, little Albert, the infant, developed a fear of the very thing that it was prevented from approaching. In this case, it was white rats. But more on that later. In addition, and if you're curious, you can look up John B. Watson, Little Albert. I think there's even YouTube videos. I'm going to be looking for those for that learning class. But if you find them first, you win. In addition to being popular in the history of psychology, Watson was also popular during his own time. He was popularizing behaviorism through books. He was writing articles. He was causing many future psychologists to optimistically enter grad school expecting to discover simple laws of behavior. At this time, universities churned out waves of psychologists trained in behaviorism. This fed the movement with fresh bodies and minds, keeping it alive for decades. If you wanted to bumper sticker things so far, we could say that psychology as a science starts with Wundt, James functionalizes it, and then Watson behaviorizes it. After World War II, behaviorism produced one of the last popularizers and luminaries of the movement. B.F. Skinner, yes, his first name is two initials. His actual first name is Burris Frederick Skinner, but I think that you can now see why he goes by B.F. Skinner. And he took Watson's behaviorism and changed the emphasis, coming up with his own flavor of behaviorism. Skinner's work looked like what animal trainers do. You reward small behaviors to shape those behaviors into a larger behavior, right? In general, if you want your dog to go into a circle, right, like to walk into a circle before it gets a treat, very rarely does it just do a circle and get rewarded for it from the first time. Usually you have to shape that behavior. Oh, it's almost walked into a circle, and you keep treating it, giving it treats as it gets closer and closer to this bigger behavior. And then finally, at the end of all this training, you know that it expects a treat after it has done a full circle. You have trained that animal, you have shaped that behavior. That behavior shaping is essentially what B.F. Skinner was doing in his version of behaviorism. Skinner also inadvertently and ironically signaled, being the last real cheerleader for behaviorism, he was also kind of signaled the end of behaviorism in his 1957 attempt to explain the behavior of language acquisition. That was a really bad move on his part. Further, as research progressed along the behaviorist agenda, psychologists found that the behavior of a rat in a maze was more complicated than they had expected. While psychologists continue to study animal learning, the goals and methods have changed. I briefly mentioned World War II a moment ago, but the effects of the world wars on psychology deserve just a touch more elaboration. If necessity is the mother of invention, then IQ tests and clinical psychology were necessities created by the First and Second World Wars, respectively. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to leave IQ alone. We'll be covering that in its own lecture. So, in short, the field of clinical psychology, as we currently know it, is born out of the need by the government to treat our veterans. Let me explain. The Second World War and the U.S. involvement in it occurred at a time in psychological history when behaviorism was dominating experimental psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis was dominating psychiatry. When soldiers from World War II began returning home from the war en masse in the late 1940s, they had symptoms symptoms that at the time were classified as shell shock, or what is now termed post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a need for therapists to treat these veterans with these symptoms. Psychiatrists could help, right? Because, like I said, Freud was a psychiatrist. But here's the weird thing about psychiatry. Psychiatry is a medical field, which means that if we wanted more psychiatrists to help treat these veterans, they'd have to wait a long time because it takes a long time to graduate with a medical degree. So psychiatry is actually a branch of medicine, and medical school training is quite arduous and takes quite a long time to complete. Clinical psychologists, on the other hand, while they did exist at the time, they were mostly PhD students or PhD graduates in experimental psychology who administered tests for assessment. So it wasn't clinical like how we understand it now. It meant something different. But the term clinical psychology did exist. Unlike psychiatrists who are medical doctors, clinical psychologists didn't treat disorders and couldn't, and still cannot, prescribe medicine. That's the advantage to going to a psychiatry. They can prescribe medicines. Psychologists don't. Seeing a demand for therapy service without the appropriate supply of therapists, the U.S. Veterans Administration set up a doctoral level program for clinical psychology, trained specifically in the techniques of therapy at a bunch of different universities. In 1950, half of those graduating with a PhD in psychology were now clinical psychologists, still not able to prescribe medicines, but qualified enough and licensed to provide therapy to our veterans. Again, the field of clinical psychology, as we currently know it, is born out of the need by the government to treat our veterans. Something to keep in mind. Computing machines had existed before World War II, but the war placed pressure on the progress of their development and used specialized computers to make mechanical calculations needed for equipment. After the war, computers advanced in their ability to be automatic, increasingly replacing mechanical inputs from humans with sophisticated processors that help perform calculations. Professors in universities using computers at the cutting edge of technology were noticing that computers provided a schematic layout for how a mind could possibly be constructed. There's information inputs, there's short-term memory like RAM, there's long-term memory like your hard drive, and ways to store, retrieve, and manipulate information via processors. So now researchers had this robust as-if model that they could try to ask questions about the mind from. All the while, behaviorism is still dominating psychology, setting up this David and Goliath story between Noam Chomsky and B.F. Skinner. So let's talk about that. Noam Chomsky is still alive. So the cognitive revolution is what this is called. This development, this use of computers as an information processing model of the human mind is called cognitive psychology. And the cognitive revolution, the beginning of cognitive psychology, and what was it revolting against? Obviously, it was revolting against behaviorism. Behaviorism said there's nothing to the mind. There's nothing to cognitate about. Who cares? And cognitive psychologists were like, yeah, there is. In the same way that geologists can make inferences about layers of the earth, we can make inferences about the mind, right? So now all of a sudden things are shifting. Didn't care about the mind. Now we really care about the mind. With the onset of the cognitive revolution, psychologists became interested in more and more specialized topics, more like memory, research dedicated to learning, research dedicated exclusively to emotion, to personality, to intelligence, human development, social learning, bonding, persuasion, etc. Oh, that was for the next slide. Maybe I'll cut this out, but ignore what I said because you're going to hear it about 5 seconds later. All right, I'm talking about Noam Chomsky. I skipped down in my script. So Noam Chomsky, cognitive revolution. What are they revolting against? Behaviorism. Why? Because there's something to be said about cognition. So Noam Chomsky was a linguist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, otherwise known as MIT. Linguist is somebody who studies language. And he was asked to review B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, in 1957. And Chomsky took Skinner and behaviorism as a field. He took them to task because in his critique of the book, he deconstructs the whole research model of behaviorism. Chomsky was a voice for this growing field of cognition-oriented research and model building, inspired by the advance of computers. The cognitive revolution was in full swing. We're going to revisit this story about the cognitive revolution, Noam Chomsky and Skinner, later in the semester. We're also going to be talking more about Noam Chomsky when we talk about cognition and language, him being a linguist and kicking off the cognitive revolution. So now the thing that I said earlier should make sense. With the onset of the cognitive revolution, psychologists became interested in more and more specialized topics. So now there was a whole field of psychology dedicated to memory, or just learning, or emotion, or personality, or intelligence, or human development, or social learning, or bonding, or persuasion. You just name it. All of these touch on both cognitive and behavior in accounting for their human experiences. So as we will see when I really summarize things, the pendulum swung. The pendulum started at the mind. It swung towards behaviorism. Then the cognitive revolution swings back towards the mind. Since the cognitive revolution, the pendulum's kind of swinging right in the middle. We pay more attention. We pay as much attention to behavior as we do cognition. It should be a 50-50. Today, few psychologists expect a grand theory that will revolutionize our understanding in the same way that Darwin or Newton revolutionized biology or physics. Most psychologists today attempt to answer more limited questions, right? So basic research seeks theoretical knowledge for its own sake. Basic research is where I work. I work in a lab that studies the psychology of the sense of smell. We're literally doing basic research. Seeks theoretical knowledge for its own sake, such as understanding the processes of learning and memory. Applied research deals with practical problems. So think of a sports psychologist, right? They are taking the information that they have about social psychology, counseling, and they're applying it to athletes, right? You need to be in a certain frame of mind if you're going to be a winner. You need to have a certain mindset to be a victor in competition. That's the application. The two kinds of research, basic research and applied research, they're complementary, they're mutually supportive, understanding that the basic processes, once they're discovered, they help the applied researchers develop effective interventions. Those working around practical solutions sometimes discover principles that are theoretically important. So they work hand in hand. The basic research informs the applied, and then the applied research sometimes comes up with new ways of thinking about the basic building blocks. Think about the most recent Olympics with gymnast Simone Biles. She was honest enough to admit that her head wasn't in the game. Preparing the frame of mind necessary to win the Olympics is enough pressure to make diamonds. It's crushing. The mental protocol that Simone Biles had for competition was likely a ritual influenced by both her coach and a sports psychologist, applied research, using the most recent basic science to inform their techniques. Also, bravo for people that are able to admit awesome things under pressure. Okay. I just had to get that in. So here we go. The truly painful, super basic history of psychology. Here's the pendulum analogy again. Looking over this here we go. Super basic history of psychology. We can summarize events in an even more simple and truly painful basic history of psychology. If you're going to take notes, write this down. The focus of psychology has, like a pendulum, swung from the mind to behavior and back. It's that simple, right? When we're talking about Plato and Rene Descartes, we're talking about introspection. And also, when we talk about James and we talk about Wundt, we're talking about introspecting into the mind. And then the pendulum swings, and behaviorists are like, to hell with that. We just want behavior. And then the pendulum swings again, and Noam Chomsky comes along and says, to hell with that. We want to look at both the mind and behavior, but mostly the mind. And then the pendulum right now is in the process of kind of settling in between, where psychologists are equally interested in what's happening cognitively and behaviorally. The philosophers that we covered, as well as the Wundtian, Jamesian, and Freudian schools of psychology, focused on exploring the mind through introspection. Behaviorists said, to hell with that. We can't see mental events, and science needs to be empirical and observable. Cognitive psychologists said, no, to hell with that. We can make inferences just like any other science, which leads us today where psychologists combine both objective behavior measures with subjective rating measures to capture a more balanced picture of human experience. Returning to structuralism and functionalism. Current research is, as I mentioned, still mostly a variant of structuralism, starting with a smaller elemental phenomena in an attempt to build an understanding of a larger, more complex experience. Technology is allowing more attempts at functional research, and as it advances, we'll be better able to collect data in real time while people are experiencing real life events to detect functional patterns or algorithms that are more meaningful than looking at our heart rate, brain waves, or behavior in isolation. I also want you to think about the future. I want you to think about a future where human experience is better understood and measured with devices that you wear, devices you might be wearing right now. Okay? There are many chapters to be written in the owner's manual of being a human. Our level of human understanding and our ability to monitor our biology probably looks like magic compared to 100 or 150 years ago. But we currently take it for granted. Apple Watches, Fitbits. What's it going to look like 150 years from now? What level of understanding will we take for granted? What data will wearable devices provide, and what algorithms will exist to process that information into telling us about ourselves? I don't know, but it is something I want you to think about. You did it. We finished this lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it. I love the history of psychology. I hope that you do too.